All right, screenagers, welcome back to another episode of the Canon. We have another amazing episode lined up for you today. We're going to be talking Apocalypse Now, and I'm very excited for this one. Got a very special guest, one of my good friends, one of my dear friends, who I'm very, very excited to welcome onto the show. We'll get into it a little bit later in terms of why I've invited this particular person on for this episode. But John Corey Lechner, aka Tex, aka Texner, aka a gazillion other nicknames.
Lurchy, yeah, Lexner. I've heard them all.
Welcome to the show. How's it going, dude?
Great. Yeah, long time listener, first time caller here. Really excited. It's one of my absolute favorite movies. First saw it when I was a senior in high school, and then we ended up watching it again.
Yeah.
In college, which is why I'm here.
Yeah.
We had the same. You can go for that one, but yeah, it's your podcast.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But also in sort of more exciting news, this is an in-person episode, which I don't often get to do. So always fun to be able to, sit in the same room with someone and talk cinema. We also just watched the movie, which is
We did.
This is the second time that's been done for an episode. The first time was with our good friend Tim Quinn. We spoke about Yojimbo.
That's one of his favorites.
Yeah, of course. Being the weeb that he is.
Yes, the Buffalo Weeb.
Yeah. So we just watched the movie. We've watched it together in the past, and a movie that I think holds a very special place in both of our hearts. And we're obviously going to get into all of that. But I guess for the listener's sake, just so they sort of know, where we're coming from, again, why you're on, because I don't want people to think that I'm just, inviting people onto the podcast just for the sake of it. Like, there's a reason that you're on.
Correct.
I would say that you're kind of an expert in this area.
I would certainly say I have more just general knowledge of the conflicts in Vietnam and, the colonialism from the French era and everything else. I studied international relations while we were at Syracuse. So I have some more of that, but as an armchair expert, absolutely.
Yeah.
Would I put my credentials down in a peer-reviewed journal? Probably not.
All right, so we're both just a couple of armchair experts,
which
is totally
we're just two dudes.
Yeah, two dudes. That's podcasting, right? That's it. So we're doing the thing. You mentioned before we went to school together, which is where we met, and we both took a class. Did we take it together, or did we take it at different times?
We took it together.
Okay.
Yes.
It gets messy because I know a lot of people who we know.
They took it based on our recommendation.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the class that we're talking about, it was specific to Vietnam War through the lens of cinema. So we watched Apocalypse Now. We watched Platoon. We watched Hamburger Hill. We watched Full Metal Jacket. And then we also watched a bunch of documentaries. So it was a great class. It was cool for people who were studying history, people who were studying, you studied international relations.
Correct.
I studied film, so it was cool for me in that sense. Really just a really interesting class where, based on a lot of different sort of areas of study, different people were able to, get different things out of said class.
Correct. And it was a long class. I believe it was 4 hours. Only met once a week, but that was because we just watched the final cut, which is not as long as Redux, which we did watch in class. We did watch Redux, but it also gave us time afterwards the professor was very good about asking what do we think of the themes and what do we notice differently between the films as the Vietnam War progressed, and certainly after the films that were made during Vietnam. Very different post-Vietnam, post-Watergate.
Yeah, because there were some movies that we watched in that class that were made in the mid 60s.
Yeah, there was that one that was very clearly filmed in Southern California, but it was it kind of reminded me, I don't remember what the name of the film was, but it almost the cinematography almost reminded me of a Blair Witch Project. There was a lot of handheld, shaky, running through the jungle. I think ultimately it just made it seem more chaotic, like the war was, but
I think I might be thinking of a slightly different one. There was one that was very much so like late JFK era, sort of propaganda for why we were
the Green Berets with John Wayne.
Yeah.
And that's
night and day difference between what you get in 79 with Apocalypse Now.
Correct.
Like completely different reading of like what's going on in the war and all that. So very interesting. Dude, I don't even like know where to start with this movie. There's so much to talk about. I feel like we should sort of just dive right in because
I think so.
we're gonna hit a lot of different areas. Listener, apologies in advance. We're gonna be jumping all over the place. We're gonna get excited and jump from thing to thing, from topic to topic.
Tangents will run wildly.
Yeah, scene to scene. Yeah, tangents galore. So just get ready for it. I think the place I usually like to start when talking about movies is just getting a sense everyone's like first time watching a given movie. And I know before we watched it this time around, you told me about your first viewing experience,
I
which is
did.
pretty great. So I feel like that should definitely be said on mic.
Oh yeah, I 100% agree. So I was visiting my family in North Carolina, and we went to this ice cream spot in Fuquay-Varina, North Carolina, Southern Wake County, and wonderful ice cream, beautiful summer's day. And my grandfather nudged me and says, "Hey, they have this jalapeno ice cream." So I had it and it was fine. And they said, "Oh, you can go hotter and hotter." So eventually I got to the hottest habanero ice cream they had. And I was one of 4 people that signed the waiver to do so. And then we're on our way back to my grandparents' house. We had rented Apocalypse Now from Blockbuster. This was 2008, remember?
Yeah.
We had it on DVD. And the whole time, the habaneros and the ice cream the frozen ones must have just set off like a depth charge. If you've seen hot ones, you understand how a severe spice can afflict someone. Here I am, 16 years old. I am profusely sweating, probably hallucinating in some ways. My body was really not sure what's going on. And then I start watching Apocalypse Now with my father, and you see the scenes of napalm and the trees and Jim Morrison and the Doors, just the end. I'm like, what is happening? And here I am, August in North Carolina, just pouring sweat on my grandparents' leather couch, writhing in pain. And I really think it did enhance my viewing of the movie because it is so surreal and out there and just, dare I say, almost not wacky because it's not like whimsical, but it's not like other war movies.
It's pretty kooky. It's very much so it's like an experiment in like tapping into the psyche of war as opposed to just like showing you like here's like what happens in war. It's very much so putting you into the experience of what it's like to lose your mind because you're,
if anything, the war is a vehicle for this morality tale and the exposition of the human psyche.
Yeah.
It just so happens it's set during Vietnam, much like the book was set during The Heart of Darkness, that part of the movie was based on, set in, King Leopold era Belgium.
Yeah. Okay, we will get into the book, and I do love that story of your first time watching. It really does, like, that has to enhance the experience of just like you're kind of tripping, you have no idea what's going on, you're sweating bullets, and then you're like, wait, like, is this actually happening in the movie, or
it was really, and I had, I was a casual Doors fan in high school, and I had never heard that song, and I was talking to my dad, it's like, is this Jim Morrison? He's like, yeah, of course it is. And here I am, is like, I don't know which way's up. I've eaten too much habanero ice cream.
Kind of like Martin Sheen.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't remember the first time that I actually watched this movie, but I do want to give the sort of like background for just full disclosure sake, because a movie like Apocalypse Now I have a very interesting relationship to it. It's not my favorite war movie, but this is actually the first war movie. I was just looking through the list of episodes. This is the first war movie that we've done an episode on so far.
Really?
So super interesting. Also going through the list of movies in the canon, and I believe this is the only Vietnam War movie that's in the canon. No Platoon, no Full
Deer Hunter?
Jacket. Maybe Deer Hunter.
But Deer Hunter is almost, in a way, the vehicle is Vietnam, but it's also, again,
it's
like,
something else.
yes.
Yeah. So Vietnam War movies for me are very special because, Texas, my dad fought in Vietnam.
Yes.
So growing up, I was like lucky enough for him to have an experience over there where he wasn't on the front lines. He was a chef on a base. So he was like pretty open with talking about his experience. He took me and my sisters to Vietnam for the 40th anniversary of his initial deployment over there. So like Vietnam and the Vietnam War has always been like a big part of like my personal history, my family history, my relationship to my dad, and like a
Right.
lot of that was experienced through or like communicated through movies. Like I remember like watching Platoon with him and being like, yeah, I mean like that's how it was. That's like how
Yes.
shit went down. Like awful shit like that would happen in villages. Like watching Apocalypse Now with him and being like, and him saying, it's very unfortunate, but like this is sort of the story of so many countless, you know, young men who were sent over there for, you know, God knows what reason they didn't know, and they lose their lives for like a cause that they're not totally sure of like what it is.
Yes.
Um, yeah, Vietnam War movies mean a lot to me. Apocalypse Now definitely up there in terms of like movies that mean a lot to me on like a very personal level. And I've always sort of viewed Apocalypse Now as like not really being a Vietnam movie because it is a very like particular depiction of Vietnam. That's
Yes.
not what we're used to seeing in like history books or anything like that. It is more of a dramatic, like operatic view of the war as opposed to something like Platoon that's like super grounded in
Right.
like reality of what was happening in the war. But rewatching it just now this last time, I feel like there is still a lot of that like grounded element within this movie.
Yes, I agree. I know as much as I would consider Apocalypse Now a movie about a war as opposed to a war movie, like Full Metal Jacket and Platoon or Hamburger Hill, which we also watched
Yeah.
in that history of the Vietnam War through film, were very much just this is the war, this is the objective, and
Yeah.
everything else. Here, it's more it's muddied, and
Yeah.
the morality is gray, and no one has any moral clarity. I don't think.
Yeah. There's really not even it's not even about the war. Like the war is just fully a
There,
backdrop. Yeah.
yes,
It's just like something that's happening in the background while this guy like is
has this
trying to do
impossible
this thing.
mission.
Yeah.
Yes,
Absolutely insane. So, okay, before we talk about the book, let's talk about the different actually no, let's talk about the book first and then the cuts. You've read Heart of
I
Darkness.
have. Yes, I read it in high school, in my AP literature class, my senior year.
So was that before or after you had seen this movie?
So I had
Being on your grandmother's couch.
I had actually so when we because I remember doing we actually had to film like a camcorder, like a project about Heart of Darkness. And I ended up building, in the book, the character Marlowe, who in the movie is a stand-in. Marlowe is Colonel Willard. Kurtz is the same person, but Marlowe is sent upriver years before he's recollecting this. So he's basically on a boat waiting to get through customs in London, and he starts telling the story about how he was contracted by this company to.
Yeah.
It's not explicitly stated in the novel, but it's very clearly supposed to be the Congo River, and it's all about rubber plantations and how initially what became Belgian Congo was personal property of King Leopold, and once rubber became a commodity that people wanted for bicycle tires and car tires, and all of this expansion of industrialism in the late 1900s and early 2000 or the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it was brutal. I do urge you to look into it. It is an underreported area of history, in my opinion. And in the book, the man Kurtz is charged with getting as much rubber out of the interior of the Congo as he can, and slowly as he gets further and further away from civilization, and there's some paternalistic attitudes in that from the late 19th century. It was written at a very different time. But Kurtz slowly loses his mind, and it's really, the movie touches us on that as well, is this pursuit of, in the book it's rubber, and in the movie it's in a pursuit of control and wanting to win the war, and it's ultimately fruitless.
I have nothing else to add because I have not read the book.
No, it's a novella. It's pretty short. I mean,
Yeah.
you could get through it in a day or two, probably. Yeah,
I feel like it's very much so like high school lit class vibes.
it is.
Like essential reading for that. But yeah, I'd never read it. So my only familiarity with the story is through Apocalypse Now. Okay, so let's go back to the different versions because we were talking about this before, but the first episode of the canon was about Blade Runner, and I think the only movie that rivals or beats Apocalypse Now in terms of number of cuts is Blade Runner, but Apocalypse Now is up there as
It
well.
is.
So can you walk us through all of the different cuts that there are,
Sure.
and
So yeah.
maybe some of the differences between them?
Yeah, so I mean, I have actually not seen this. Raph has seen this, but I need to watch it. The documentary called Heart of Darkness, which is about the filming of Apocalypse Now. The quote that Francis Ford Coppola, we had access to too much money, too much time, and slowly we went insane. Then they ended up shooting like 1,000,000 feet of film or something.
Like
It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, but it was actually shown unfinished.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the original version that came out cut a lot of scenes that actually, as we saw in the opening to the final cut, Coppola talking about those different cuts, and the movie was really out there and kind of surreal. So they made the cut that was the theatrical release in 1979 in the early 80s. And then he came back and added in a lot of the shots that became Apocalypse Now Redux, and ended up adding about an additional hour. And I believe 10 years ago was when the final cut came out. Yeah. And it's essentially the original cut and Redux, just not 3.5 hours long. It's only 3 hours and 1 minute.
Yeah. It is. I guess it must have been around the time of the 40th anniversary or the 50th anniversary.
Yeah, I mean, 40. Yeah, the 40th was 5 years ago. So so the next 50th would be coming up. Yeah.
So it must have been for the 40th, and I think that's the box set that I have that we were able to.
It's Coppola's. I think it's Coppola's definitive.
It's his definitive version. Yeah, I mean it's absolutely great. I can't say that I've watched the final cut before. I think before then I had only ever watched Redux.
No, because I had I watched the original theatrical cut from Blockbuster about a month later, or maybe 2 months later. It was my birthday. I got Apocalypse Now on DVD, and the dossier was the original cut and Redux. My friends and I watched Redux one New Year's Day, I believe, once we woke up. All of us were just like, how long is this movie? Yeah. And we watched Redux in the class, too.
That class.
Yeah.
I can't remember our discussion about Apocalypse Now in that class, but I'm sure it was great.
I mean, I think the reason we watched the Redux version is because, for those unfamiliar with the Redux version, there was a large scene that was cut from the theatrical release, but it involves Colonel Willard and the rest of the PBR street gang arriving at the remnants of the former, French Indochina. It's a French rubber plantation, which ties it back into the Heart of Darkness. Yeah. And we believe we watched the Redux because our professor wanted to draw parallels to the Heart of Darkness being a book about colonialism, and Apocalypse Now, instead of being about colonialism, about American interventionism or military interventionism more broadly.
Yeah.
But the scene at the plantation then ties it in from, the Americans came in and they were essentially fighting a colonial war. Mm-hmm. And it was a carryover from what the French were doing.
Yeah. And I guess it's interesting now. I don't know. It's hard to it's hard for me to not have that context, because I feel like that context is so abundantly obvious, at least to me. But I don't know if it was necessarily to people in 1979, if it was to Americans when the war in Vietnam first started escalating, even if that is super clear to most Americans today, right? If most people are aware of those connections between the French colonial era in Vietnam, and then how our war there was just a continuation of that. And I mean, we were sort of talking about it while watching the movie, but the history of the country of Vietnam is one that is just littered with trying to get people, outsiders, out of their country.
Yes,
a lot of outsiders looking to control them, and then being hey, can you guys just can leave?
Just leave us alone. Please. Yes,
please leave us alone. And
yeah,
this war, obviously we're Americans, so we approach it from the American perspective of the Cold War and trying to contain communism and stuff. But there is this whole other context to said war that we don't really understand, but should understand. And I think the French characters, the French like the scenes with the French characters in this movie like really like hammer that home. Um,
Agreed.
in a way while we were watching it just now, it was like, the scene is kind of dragging on a little bit. And I was like, I don't know if it's like all that necessary, but then also thinking about it, not to say that I am like an expert on, you know, the French presence in Indochina. I couldn't even tell you like when it was. Like that's how little I know about it. But
I
enough to know that like,
yeah, I
okay,
want to.
you see French people there, and you're like, okay, that's a connection between their colonial period there and then what the Americans were doing there. And I don't know if we need a full scene of that, but it is necessary to hammer the point home.
Exactly. I know I want to say French Indochina became a colony in the late 19th century, but who became the Viet Cong, which were the irregulars in Vietnam. There was also the North Vietnamese Army. The Viet Cong were the guerrilla fighters and the people that lived in South Vietnam,
mostly the South, who wanted to unite the country.
They were a legacy of, and they mentioned this in the plantation scene. They were a legacy of the Viet Minh, which were a resistance group led by Ho Chi Minh, who were fighting the Japanese occupation of what at the time was French Indochina, and helped to get the Japanese out. And the French returned and said, "Hey, it's just like before." And you bring up the legacy, like before it was the French, there was the Chinese, the Khmer Empire at one point, which is in Cambodia. If you've seen the Temple of Angkor Wat was in control of Vietnam, then obviously there was the Japanese. And so, I mean, you look at it, and there's certain scholars, and I believe we talked about this in the class, but they really look at it as like a 30-year revolutionary war. They were just they were fighting different people.
They didn't for the Vietnamese, it wasn't like a matter of who they were fighting. It was just fighting for their own independence and like self-determination. And right, a lot of the war from the American standpoint was just like a war of arrogance and like ignorance, where we didn't understand like why it was that these people were fighting us. I think you mentioned the Ken Burns documentary.
Agreed. Yeah.
What was the quote?
So there was and if you haven't seen it, it's absolutely fantastic. The Ken Burns Vietnam War documentary, and he interviews these American vets. I believe there may be some interviews with some French vets in the beginning, because it really does go through the whole cycle.
Yeah.
I mean, the Tet Offensive isn't even until like episode 6 or 7, because the Americans were doing a lot of stuff in Vietnam before 1968 and 69, when Apocalypse Now is set. But they had an interview with this Vietnamese soldier, and I believe there's something about like, oh, what do you know about Karl Marx or communism or anything? He's like, I didn't care what system it was. They were just the occupiers. I didn't think anything of it.
Yeah, we're fighting this war to, stop communism, and they're just fighting it for the sake of their people. All right, how do we tie this back to Apocalypse Now? We're gonna, like we said, we're gonna go in a lot of tangents
galore.
A lot of tangents. You got two history nerds in here, so we're definitely gonna go on some more of those related tangents. But so we spoke about the different cuts. We watched the final cut, definitely the definitive version. We spoke about the scene with the French on the French plantation and like that cut. But there's one scene in particular that you shouted out that was cut from the theatrical version. It's a very small, minor.
It is very small.
It is very telling. So do you want to tell us about
Sure.
that?
Yeah. So in my research before coming on the show and watching it today, and this is not, I believe this isn't in Redux. I don't remember it being in Redux, and it's certainly not in the original cut. And the actor who plays Colonel Kilgore, the head of the air cavalry from the probably the most famous scene from Apocalypse Now is the helicopter scene with Ride of the Valkyries. Robert Duvall, the actor playing Colonel Kilgore, at one point stops like directing his troops from fighting and a couple of them surfing. He's an odd duck of a character, but he makes sure that a wounded baby and her mother get on one of the helicopters and get to a hospital. And it showed, there was a bit more ambiguity to his character. So Robert Duvall was a little upset that was cut. But it's interesting because Willard later says, we cut these people in half with a machine gun and give them a Band-Aid and think it's all going to be good. And it really gets to the point of, the arrogance of American general leadership that, we'd win hearts and minds by total firepower superiority. And that just very clearly didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. Should we talk about Duvall's character and his performance? Because, like you said, it's probably the most iconic scene from the movie.
He's a cowboy in a helicopter, essentially. Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty badass,
Correct. And we also talked about this because, there's people go back and forth on, whether or not making a movie about war can ever be truly anti-war. And I think people focus in on the scene from the helicopters because it is an awe-inspiring scene, whether or not visually and it's so well shot, and you feel the sense of urgency and almost the stress of all of it. And in the end, they take the village and then they just go. And that was kind of par for course. They counted the bodies, they saw how much ammunition they expended, and they sent a report back to head HQ and said mission solved. It was very, it was very, it's very clearly an anti-war movie. I will stake my assumption on that. And it's like, even the helicopter scene, it's like, it's well shot and it looks cool, but like the subtext behind it is more important than the actual scene itself.
Well, even with the scene that small moment that you were talking about of, what's the character's name? Because I always
Colonel Kilgore.
Colonel Kilgore, which is like incredible name, hilarious name, Kilgore. Like we're gonna be super literal with with who he is and like what he does. But even with that scene of him with the mother and the child, like, okay, there is a bit of ambiguity, but it's still very, very obvious that this dude is a total maniac. Probably the most famous line from this movie is, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." Which is like, okay, it can be seen as like super cool. He's got his shirt off. He's wearing his cavalry hat. He's on the beach.
Dog tags hanging, aviator sunglasses.
The lighting is like immaculate, all that stuff. But like the line itself is fucking nuts. Like that's an insane thing to say.
And the crazy thing about him saying that line is they bombed this hill. There was all sorts of numbered hills in Vietnam that hundreds, if not thousands, of American GIs and ARVN, and not to mention any of the Viet Cong or the NVA who all died as well. They would expend so much ammunition on these hills and say, "Oh, we got it done. Send the report back to HQ." Colonel Kilgore says they bombed this hill for napalm for 8-10 hours, and they go there and there's not a strip of tree, there's not any vegetation, and they find no enemy dead. And then he says, "Someday we'll win this war." And I really, one of the themes I never really thought about in the movie was just the general arrogance of any of the protagonists or antagonists on either side, and that's the arrogance of the American military. In terms of how they were going about prosecuting this war.
Well, there's like an arrogance to him, but there's also like he's a full-on sicko in terms of
his approach.
He loves being there. He's aware of like how demented it is for him to be saying like, "I love that smell of gasoline. I love all of this destruction that I'm bringing to the world
because
like,
I want to surf. I want to. They take this outpost on the entrance to the Nung River because it's a good surfing spot." And then probably the second most famous line: "Charlie, don't surf."
Charlie, don't surf. Yeah, man. It's like, again, it's like the war is just the backdrop. Even for him at that moment, the war is just the backdrop. He's only carrying out this mission to secure this outpost just so that they can surf. It's not because there's any sort of like tactical advantage to having this location or anything like that. Just, I'm with this famous surfer and I have some boys in my crew who want to surf. We should, kill a bunch of Vietnamese people so that we can enjoy the breaks for a few hours. That's psychotic.
The surfers are out there and there's mortars going off near them. It's almost comical because these guys are falling off their surfboards and like, it would be funny if it wasn't, if that was a MASH episode, that'd be funny. But this is very clearly an exploration of the human psyche, and it's Kilgore is certainly one psychotic aspect of that.
Yeah. I think to me, he's obviously of all is like scene stealer, probably the best supporting character slash actor in the
I
movie.
want,
I mean,
I want to say he was nominated for supporting actor or something for this, but
yeah. I mean, again, to go back to your like, is this anti-war? Is it not? Like just because he is such an iconic figure within cinema doesn't necessarily mean that he's one to be celebrated.
no,
Right? Same with like the scene with the helicopters and Ride of the Valkyries. Like, okay, this is like very iconic and like ubiquitous. We all know it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like something that we celebrate. And I feel like with cinema, and this is devolve into a totally different conversation, but that's just something that like happens across the board where just because something is it's so like omnipresent in cinema culture, we automatically like ascribe some sort of like positive feeling to it, even though its messaging is like very clearly not celebrating what it is that it's portraying.
exactly.
And, like,
You
that's
know,
this movie's goal.
people always say this about Goodfellas, and Henry gets away with it at the end. It's like I really don't think Scorsese had any of that movie made out to be something that was supposed to be aspirational.
Yeah. Same with this
Yes,
movie.
exactly.
Like, yeah. It's like, wow, that does look kind of cool, but like also like, no, it's not cool to ride on helicopters with your boys and exterminate entire villages.
Not at all.
Like it's not something that we should be aspiring to.
No.
And it shouldn't be too controversial of a statement to say that. All right, so we've got Kilgore, we've got the surfing scene. I don't know if we want to just like take the movie up the river or if we want to jump around a little bit.
I think we
Do you want
should.
to
I
go
think
to any other. Well, we already spoke about the French folks. We spoke about Kilgore. Let's save Kurtz a little bit.
yes,
Let's talk about
because really, Kurtz is he's an enigma in the movie, and he looms over it large. And you don't see him until the very, very end, and he's in shadow. He becomes this mythical figure. So he looms large over the story, and he's the driving antagonist, but it's not it's not really the full antagonist in the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
As they go upriver, there's all sorts of different things they come into contact with, and his own tribulations and trials and everything.
Should we talk about the dudes who are going upriver with what's Sheen's character's name?
Colonel Willard. Or sorry, Captain Willard. Captain Willard.
Well, maybe we should talk about Willard a little bit.
Yeah, we'll start and then go up the river and go from there.
So when we first meet Willard, he is like this movie is so clear in what it's trying to tell us from the jump.
Yes.
Like our first meeting of Willard is him losing his mind in a hotel room,
psychotic break, PTSD.
Yeah. Like had a tour previously, went home, divorced his wife,
couldn't handle it.
He like literally could not handle going back to the real world. Like he is now only able to exist within
the state of war
zone, within a state of war, in this like completely deranged existence. So we first meet him like fully having a mental breakdown, and then Harrison Ford and some other guy come up to him and they're like, "Hey, can you kill this general?
Terminate with extreme prejudice." Yeah, it's in it's the scene in question. He, Martin Sheen is clearly going through some stuff, and he actually punches a mirror in the scene, and it was a real mirror. He wasn't supposed to do that, and the blood is real, and everything in there is real. It was his 36th birthday, and Martin Sheen called it like the spontaneous performance, an exorcism of his alcoholism. And I mean, everyone went through Martin Sheen ended up having a heart attack filming this movie. It took 4 years. I mentioned to you earlier, Lawrence Fishburne was 14 when they started filming, and he was old enough to vote when they finished.
Insane.
This man is clearly suffering. And I mentioned to Raph while we were watching, as far as I know, that it might be one of the first real PTSD, like the stress trauma that I've seen in a war movie that, it wasn't played for, like, oh, this guy, like, here's a train whistle and he gets jumpy, like with like a World War I movie when they had shell shock. And it was like very clear this man has gone through the ringer, and he's not the only one. Everyone has some sort of break, in the movie, or at some point we're like, why are we here? Like
Yeah.
they're all broken in their own ways.
Well, oh man, I mean, there's so much there. I think for me watching it this time, they're the Lance character, who's one of the dudes on the boat,
Yes.
taking Willard up the river.
He's the famous surfer.
He's the famous surfer
Yes.
dude. So when we first meet Willard, he's like someone who has gone through a mental break, and he's like very much so having a moment when we first meet him. He's doing like fake Tai Chi in his room.
Fake drunken Tai Chi.
Yeah, as one does. But then the Lance character, who starts off like pretty chill, pretty laid back, very low key kind of character. Over the course of the movie, we see the full progression of like someone being traumatized, not in
Very
real
much
time,
so.
but we see him as he experiences different aspects of the war, the death, the destruction, the meaninglessness of all of it. He then gets to a point where he's doing the same sort of fake Tai Chi on the boat.
Yes.
And it's like, oh, we've watched with him everything that happened to Willard before the movie started.
And I had never noticed that until this watch through, because I looked over at you and I said, he's doing the same dance that Martin Sheen as Captain Willard did in the very beginning of the movie. And you see the other Green Beret that was sent upriver first, and he's doing it in a scene late in the movie once we finally meet Kurtz all the way up the river. But
look at all these parallels.
Look at all these parallels.
Francis Coppola, you dog, you absolute dog.
Say what you will about the man's wine, but the bastard knows story structure.
He knows how to put together a visual image. Yeah, man. So the Willard character, who's like, I guess he is our protagonist, but there are like a lot of moments within the movie where you like forget that he's the main character. Like we spend so much time with all these other characters that we get like so wrapped up in what it is that they're doing, and then
he's an everyman for the rest of us. Like clearly he's not a stock character, but he is meant to be someone that we're the person on the boat with Willard, and we're experiencing this with him, and then the nuance and a lot of the other characters is more broad because we're experiencing it through Willard's eyes and his narration and his thoughts are the only narration we hear in the movie.
Yeah. He is a great character, but so are the other dudes on the boats.
The boat crew. I mean, those are people that bring him up the river, and very. I mentioned this to Ralph while you're watching. The theme of paternalism in terms of the French coming in and saying we're going to civilize. I say in air quotes because that's obviously it's not cool. The Americans came in and you're not going to be communist. We're going to protect you from all this other stuff. And it's just very, very paternalistic, very a top-down directive juxtaposed with the father figures in the movie. Kurtz is obviously a father figure to the people he takes over. And when we get to the boat, there's a very clear hierarchy. The chief is the chief. He runs a tight ship. But the three men on the boat, they're all draftees, and one, Lawrence Fishburne's character is 17 from the South Bronx, and you have a surfer from Orange County and a chef from New Orleans. None of them want to be there, but the only moments of tenderness and like human love you see in the movie is Chief caring about his soldiers, and even Kilgore caring about his soldiers in a way that you don't see through anyone else. As much as these characters are meant, especially Kilgore, clearly not good people. It's ambiguous in the way that they care about their men.
Yeah, they haven't like fully lost their humanity.
No,
right? I think that's one of the interesting things when it comes to war movies is like, okay, like the people who are acting out the war, even like your Kilgores down to your GIs and your privates,
right?
They aren't the ones actively making the decisions to do these things. They're sort of, these decisions are like forced upon them. So the people who really have lost their humanity are all exist off screen. We could maybe say that some of the people in some of the opening scenes who are giving Willard his direction are those folks who have like fully lost their humanity. But like someone like Chief, he does make some really bad decisions that lead to awful things, like mowing down an entire boat of innocent Vietnamese people because they think that they might be smuggling
Weapons
guns and
or
ammunition or
ammo,
whatever.
what
Yeah.
have you.
And like in that moment, like he, he fucked up, but like he still does have humanity enough to care about the, the young guys that he's taking care of, or even to some extent, like he probably feels some sorrow for the people that they ended up killing. But the three young dudes on the boat, I think like that's where the actual like commentary on Vietnam as a war is like most apparent. Like they're three
100%.
draftees, like you said,
They had
three young guys.
dreams. Yeah.
Yeah. And their lives are completely ruined for what? To take some guy up the river? Like,
Yeah.
like what's the point of that? Like,
For the mission.
right, for the sake of the mission.
Mission.
And the mission can be so aimless, and to die over that is just like so beyond sad,
Yeah.
because some dudes in a room in Saigon or in Washington D.C. decided that you needed to do this, and then like you're 17, you have your whole life in front of you, your mom's leaving you a recorded message about how
Buying you a car when you get back. Oh,
your
that
family's
scene tears me up every
your
time, man.
family's saving up money to buy you a new car,
Yeah.
and she can't wait for all the grandkids that you're gonna have,
Have.
and then like all of that future is zapped away for what?
Yeah. The chef was supposed to go to cooking school in France to go
Yeah.
back to Antoine's in New Orleans. And
Yeah. And it's like,
I'm sure Lance just wanted to sit on a beach in Newport Beach and surf. Yeah.
and like he doesn't die, but he loses his freaking mind. Like he loses his marbles, and there's no way that he's going to go back to Orange County and be the same carefree surfer dude that he was before he got drafted.
No.
So like the day-to-day impact, or like the impact of like people on like a very personal level, in terms of war and fighting wars and sending young people across the world to a country that most of them couldn't point out on a map
No.
for a cause that they like couldn't
Articulate.
They didn't like know. They're like, I guess communism's bad, so we have to kill them, and that's the extent of what I know.
Yeah.
And then like their lives are ruined or lost.
And then again, there's the Vietnamese characters in the movie, and they don't have their own, they don't have their own motivations. They're really just there. Which I think it's, a lot of Vietnam movies, kind of gloss over that in terms of, they didn't speak the same language. It was such a different culture for a lot of these people. World War II was very different. People had ancestors that came from Germany or Italy or France. Those were places they had known about, and then all of a sudden here's this foreign culture to you as an American.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of Vietnam movies do a bit of a disservice to that, because the people that suffered the most were the Vietnamese, and we were they were the ones suffering from napalm and any of the Agent Orange, whatever colors, Agent Orange, Agent Yellow, all that stuff. They're the ones still dealing with landmines now. And, for a lot of these people, the Viet Cong and the Americans were just people with guns.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. We see the scene when we first meet Kilgore, they quote unquote saving the village. And there's this great juxtaposition of a person with a translator talking through a bullhorn in front of a burning church. And he just says, "We're here to help you."
Again, Francis Ford Coppola, he could put together a visual.
Yes, exactly.
Visual that, it's just the absurdity of the backdrop versus like what the people are saying in front of them. I think in that same scene, there's a priest praying for salvation for everyone.
Yes.
And behind him, there's a flamethrower just like leveling
a whole village. Yeah.
And it's like, okay, like, is the prayer going to work when it's totally juxtaposed against the actual like actions that we're taking here? Like, how can any of us take ourselves seriously,
right,
if we just take like a moment to realize what it is that we're doing, what we're seeing, what we're saying, and all that stuff? So like, yeah, like I said before, I used to not think of this movie as being like very as like actually having a lot of commentary on Vietnam, and like maybe it could have taken place in any other moment in time. But I think with a lot of that, especially those three characters on the boat, it does very much so have things to say about like the actual effects
Mm-hmm.
of that.
And the experience, yes.
Yeah. I do think, though, this movie has a bit more sympathy for Vietnamese people than like most Vietnam War
Yeah, they're
movies.
not, again, they're not characters of their own agency or something, and maybe it's slightly paternalistic, but again, yeah, they're portrayed as innocent victims.
Yeah. Which is like something.
Well, it's also, you see more, maybe Full Metal Jacket, you see more civilians,
Yeah.
but Platoon, they're way out in the sticks. The only Vietnamese
Yeah.
people you see are the actual soldiers.
Yeah. You see, there's one scene in a village where they're also kind of seen as
Which is
innocents.
again, a parallel to the My Lai massacre, but we're not here to talk about Platoon. But
Yeah.
but again, in that scene, they're also portrayed as victims.
Yeah. Which is like kind of interesting just to like compare it to like World War II movies where Nazis, because it is such a distinct like good versus evil
There was the
battle.
moral clarity there that there just never was in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And that's
So,
something
like,
they never figured out.
you can have Nazis just be like faceless villains to like mow down, and it's like fine because we're like, okay, they're Nazis, so like we don't need to
They
give them
figured
any
the end of
agency.
Inglourious
Yeah.
Bastards when everyone's cheering. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, okay, we get that, but then here it's like, well, maybe like we should give these people some agency, but like there's so much disconnect between our cultures that like how would we even go about that? So I feel like it is really like an insane struggle for any Western filmmaker to properly portray like the Vietnamese experience of what Vietnamese people call the American War.
Yes.
Like, I don't know if you've ever been to Vietnam, but
I have not, but I do know that,
that's what they call it.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not like the war of American aggression. It's just the American War, which makes a ton of sense. And like, but like, that's not something that you would think of if you haven't been outside of
the bubble.
the bubble, right? To think like, oh yeah, why would they call it the Vietnam War?
They're in Vietnam.
They're in Vietnam.
Yeah.
All right, so back to Apocalypse Now. We've got Willard. We've got the boys on the boat. Let's talk about going up the river, because we've kind of alluded to it a little bit.
Yes.
But this movie is really a descent into madness.
Correct. Further up and same as in Heart of Darkness, the further up the river, the further from quote unquote civilization they get. But the movie and the book do a very good job of saying, but what is civilization? What is good? What is bad? In the beginning of the movie, they say, Colonel Kurtz has gone totally out of bounds of the normal human decency of war. And this is from a general who has very definitely ordered napalm strikes or the leveling of forests.
Yeah.
So if that's how prosecuting the war is moral in their mind, they do a very good job of saying who's more civilized.
Yeah. Who's more civilized?
Civilized in air quotes, because it's not a concept.
What is this? Like, what is the civilized act? Is the helicopter scene to Ride of the Valkyries, like, is that a civilized act?
No.
It's just because it's industrialized or, more advanced technologically, like doesn't make it
is this human progress? Is this civilization?
Yeah. Is this like a good and decent way to treat our fellow man, like our like fellow human people who walk the earth? I would say no. But again, it like goes into that. Who has the moral high ground? Whose moral clarity is like actually real and true? Is anyone's? Are we all just sort of like bullshitting ourselves? Is there something to the more that we realize how we're all sort of shitheads, then maybe we can actually get past this and, not fall into the same traps that we fall into over and over again. And obviously this movie was made in 1979. So like, there's not like that much history in post Vietnam America or whatever to like look back on and be like, how much have we learned from this? Right? Like this movie was made really just at the tail end of the war. So
Saigon fell and last U.S. troops pulled out in 1972 or 1973, I believe. And the fall of Saigon with the dramatic pictures, you see people trying to escape like on the last helicopter out of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Also just remembered randomly, Mr. Wynn in Hey Arnold. That's how he gets his daughter out of Vietnam. So shout out to Hey Arnold. But so 4 years after, and this is the first big movie that talked about Vietnam and the experience it had on the American psyche and post Watergate and everything. The generals and the parents of the soldiers that were fighting in Nam had fought in World War II, where there was this moral clarity, and they thought with superior firepower and everything else that we can prosecute this war in the same way. And then the people that got there, hearing all these stories from their fathers or uncles in World War II and war is glory and everything else, and they get there and it's anything but.
I think the film also does a really, really, really good job at portraying that. Like, yes, it's beautifully shot. The colors are immaculate. Like, everything looks amazing. The cinematography is like delightful. The lighting is absurd.
Coppola clearly went into a Manila special effects store and said, "Give me 500 gallons of dry ice." It's gonna be moody as hell.
Yeah, I'm gonna smoke the shit out of this. But there's also like a really dirty, gritty, maybe not gritty, but like there's a really dirty aspect to this movie.
It was a dirty war.
Yeah, but like that's not something that we're seeing in movies, right? Especially war movies, like World War II movies. Like, even any dirty aspect of those, it was still like a glorious dirty.
Yeah, you think about like the Dirty Dozen or Kelly's Heroes, or even like the longest day.
Yeah,
A Bridge Too Far, the Allies lose, but they end up winning. So it's very different.
Yeah, there's like, this is totally just like, hey, this is like pretty gross. What was going on in this war?
Very much so,
and you can see it in
as they go further up the river.
We kept talking about how sweaty Martin Sheen's face is.
Yeah.
Like, even something like that is to like show you like this is like brutal stuff that's happening. This is not a glamorous.
Everyone's covered in mud as they get further and further up the river. Their uniforms get torn. There's a general breakdown of command. The last U.S. outpost on the river as they're going up is total anarchy.
Oh, man. Let's talk about the last outpost, because that scene is like maybe the most haunting part of this movie. Like, really had me like squirming in my seat.
The first, to set the scene, the boat pulls up to the last American outpost and it's clearly under attack. And as they get closer to the drop-off point, soldiers are jumping into the river with suitcases, like civilian suitcases, like just begging to get out of there.
Yeah.
They find out later that there's no commanding officer at the post. It's just soldiers
just doing war.
Yeah, just literally holding the line to say, so the generals can say the road is open, as Colonel Willard exposes on later.
Yeah, every night the bridge gets
destroyed and rebuilt,
and then the next morning it gets rebuilt. The generals can say,
"Yeah, the road's open. We have control." But there's no control.
No, there's no control whatsoever, and you can see it. All of the guys who are there. You have the one guy firing off the machine gun, yelling that he's gonna get
gonna get you, Charlie.
Yeah, and I mean, you can tell that these guys are like totally broken. Him just yelling obscenities into the night sky. They go and get another guy
who's listening to a Jimi Hendrix guitar solo, and very out there character. He's got bone necklaces and like all that. His grenade launcher is painted like a tiger.
Yeah, and he just has this blank stare, just like he is like totally lost himself. You don't know what kind of guy was there before. You assume he was like a joyful dude, and then this war has like zapped everything.
Yeah, he's just a warrior now.
Yeah, he lurks in the dark until he's called to launch his grenade, and he comes out with this like 1,000-yard stare and just launches grenades into the night sky. And again, no one knows who's in charge. They're just sort of aimlessly doing war.
That character knows who is in charge. Captain Willard asks him, and he just says, "Yeah," and he turns around and walks away because it doesn't matter who's in charge.
Who do you think he means? Do you think like I kind of read that as like he's like the Lord is in charge or something, but it could mean a gazillion different things.
It could be, yeah. I think it's very ambiguous in terms of but also, the question, who's in charge is interesting, because the whole time it's Colonel Kurtz has gone mad and has lost control, and the generals are afraid that they've lost control of him. And the overarching theme of losing control is very, the Americans wanted control, and that was the end game. But it's that the control is, it's not an end; it's a means to an end. But they didn't have an end articulated.
But that was kind of the whole point of the war, right?
Yeah.
It was, again, going back to World War II. There's like not this moral clarity of good versus evil. It's just we're fighting this war because we want to control things. And again, to go back to the French people, the French characters are extremely upset that they have lost control of this thing that they claim to be theirs, which, let's call it as it is. It was never
theirs. They may have been there for 70 years, and it was not theirs.
It was never theirs to begin with. And like this whole idea of control and like how colonialism like evolved from the 17th century through the late 20th century, and like
a desire for control, a desire for power,
and like for what, just
because everyone else was doing it.
Yeah.
Oh man, we better get in on this action.
But then it's interesting because, right, you're looking for all this external control. You want to control Captain. Oh my God, why am I blanking on his name?
Willard or Kurtz?
No, Kurtz.
Yeah, Colonel Kurtz.
Colonel Kurtz. You want to control Kurtz. You want to control this plot of land. You want to control this bridge or whatever.
You want to control the Nung River. Yes.
Yeah, but like, do you have control over yourself? Like, is anyone in this movie like looking inward for like their own sort of like personal control? Like maybe Kurtz is the only one.
Maybe Kurtz, but he looked inward and didn't like what he saw and went insane.
Yeah, so it's like it does bring up a lot of like really interesting questions about control and power and how all of that sort of expresses itself through something like war, and how that can quickly devolve into something sort of aimless that then causes all of this destruction for really nothing at all. All right, so we've gotten through a lot of the characters. We've gone through the madness of going up the river.
Yes.
We've gone through the French folks. We've gone through Kilgore.
And the helicopters.
We've gone through the helicopters. Do we want to get to Kurtz?
Well, I mean, so going back down the river slightly before the plantation and before the last outpost, there's I think a really interesting scene with the Playboy bunnies. There's a USO show.
Oh yeah.
At an outpost they stop at, still within control. Again, control in air quotes. And Colonel Willard is reflecting that the USO has beer and Playboy bunnies and a grill and a cookout for all the soldiers, and the more they try to make it look like home, the more people want to get back home.
Yeah.
And it's this total like breakdown of a sense of control at the performance.
Yeah.
The MPs can't control the soldiers that want to get over, and they haven't seen a woman in who knows how long, and then they're
a white woman.
A white woman, yes, very much so. Playboy bunnies. And just the total loss of control of that situation is just indicative of the rest of the of the war and the rest of their journey, up the river.
You brought up something interesting in that scene where I think you said like they spent all this money on these shows and the lights to like make it feel like home. You buy the grill, you buy all the beer and stuff.
Yeah.
And like, what if we just put that money towards like investing in
schools, building,
to like, hey, like teach them about like maybe this is why you guys want to step away from communism and step towards capitalism as a
hearts and minds were what they were trying to achieve in the Vietnam War, but it's very hard to get people to believe you're trying to help them and you want to focus on their hearts and minds when even it's not even just scenes of the slaughter of Vietnamese. It's some even just the boat going upriver and the surfer guy he's literally water skiing behind the PBR boat, and at one point their wake just capsizes some fishermen, and they don't die. You can see the fishermen swimming there, but even stuff like that is just the arrogance, and
Yeah.
we're here, we're in charge. You guys are just background.
Yeah. We're gonna come to your home. We're gonna piss all over the place. We're gonna punch you in the face, tell you that we're helping you,
Yeah.
and then and then leave when you get angry.
Yes.
And say, well, why did that work?
Yeah. Whoa, damnedest thing.
Should we talk a little bit more about arrogance?
I think so. Yeah. It was one of the themes I wasn't really expecting, but really came through.
Yeah.
The arrogance of all the antagonists in their own way.
Yeah. We'll talk through that. Like, who were some of the arrogant characters or figures or moments?
Certainly the American general leadership. The very beginning of the movie, Captain Willard is given his mission, and he shows up at this American Air Force base. And I commented on this to Raph in the same way that the French colonists at this beautiful mansion that's just full of riches and everything else. That the general's trailer on this American air base in Vietnam has a white picket fence and little grass, and the inside of his trailer looks like any suburban home, anywhere. And here this guy is, and we're trying to win this war, and we know how it's done, and Colonel Kurtz doesn't know how it's done. Well, Kurtz had his own arrogance and thinking he knew how to prosecute the war, and the French colonists had the arrogance to say, no, we know what we're doing here. The Americans don't.
Yeah. And none of it is taken into consideration, like
the opinions and the thoughts and feelings of the Vietnamese people.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
There's no way that Ho Chi Minh guy, he can't know the best way to go about this.
No.
It's either the French or this one American guy or this other American guy.
Exactly.
Yeah, man, everyone's arrogance like totally shines through, and that's kind of like the main antagonist of the movie. Like, right, Kurtz is the driving force, but even when he's on screen, he's not like really an antagonist.
No, he's more of a, and not to sound like Dennis Hopper's deranged photojournalist character, but Kurtz is almost more of a force of nature than he is an antagonist. He's a stand-in for human madness, human arrogance, the duality of man, and he certainly expands upon it himself pretty frequently.
All right, let's talk about the Hopper character, because he's a really interesting stand-in for just like a lot of weird stuff going on.
Yeah, because he's besides the Vietnamese and the great Bill Graham, who was a cameo appearance bringing in the Playboy bunnies to the USO show, he's one of the only civilian, and the CIA guy in the beginning who says terminate with extreme prejudice. He's really the only civilian, certainly American civilian, that you see.
Well, actually, we'll come back to Hopper, but there is that scene early on when they first link up with the cavalry and they get off the boat.
Oh,
and
yes, Coppola he's filming
his appearance as like, I mean, I don't know if they're journalists, but they're
a film crew of some kind.
They're a film crew of some kind, and he's like, don't look at the camera. Pretend we're not here.
Pretend you're fighting. Yeah.
Pretend you're fighting. This is all for TV. Which I guess in a way is kind of like the most like pure form of journalism, just like capturing like what is there, but also their presence inherently like makes things like that much more absurd and surreal. Like, what do you mean just fight like you're not there? Like, you are literally filming me going into war.
Yeah.
That is strange. That is
very strange.
A very weird occurrence. But yeah, obviously like one of the big things with Vietnam that we know now and is studied sort of at length when talking about the war is that this was like the first war that was fought on TV. Like, this is the first war that like really was in the homes of Americans
in color. You saw it on the evening news. You weren't just listening to casualty lists on the radio in World War II or in Korea. This was very much,
the war was brought into your literal home. It was like,
you saw it in the newspaper.
It's on the other side of the world, but it's like you can't avoid it, right? This is also around the time, or I guess this is pre-Watergate, but like the significance of American journalism was like still very much so a thing at this time.
And certainly, for anyone that was anti-war or, any of the alternative press for the psychedelic era and stuff like that.
Or even just like
Pentagon Papers.
You talk about like the civil rights movement and how they used TV cameras to like bring that into people's homes to like make them aware of
or
what was
the
happening.
photos of the sit-ins at lunch counters and people
Yeah.
just just dumping food all over them for just having the desire to sit at a lunch counter and
Yeah.
get a meal. It's hard to look at an image of a sheriff in Birmingham turning fire hoses on peaceful protesters. If you see that on TV, it's very different than reading it
Yeah.
in the newspaper.
Same with seeing young American men
Mutilated
or, shooting at
civilians.
nameless, faceless Vietnamese people, civilian soldiers, guerrilla combatants, whatever it may be. Like that makes it a lot more real for a lot of people in ways that wars in the past like weren't. It was like
No.
wars were just like abstract things that like happened elsewhere out on the battlefield.
And we take that for granted now because we, ever since Vietnam, every war and every conflict has been, for lack of a better term, live streamed. We see updates and we have it on social media now.
Yeah, it's like it's weird to you open up Twitter and you're like, wow, there's like I'm watching war in Ukraine like unfold before my eyes.
Yes.
And like in 1968, that was a very new thing for people.
Very new concept.
So for Coppola to like sort of inject just like not even 2 minutes of that into the movie, but like it still speaks volumes to just like how this war was so different than other wars that we had experienced in the past. Like another just like commentary on Vietnam and how different it was from something like World War II. But yeah, back to Dennis Hopper, who is also
a journalist, photojournalist. He's been, as they said, in country. He says he's been in country since 1964. So really before the U.S. accelerated their presence there. So he's been there through, I have to imagine he was there through the Tet Offensive because that was in 1968. And the term quote unquote gone native is obviously applied to Kurtz and in the novella Heart of Darkness and in the movie. But here is an example of someone who went through the same thing and wasn't a soldier, and he still has that trauma, and he's still trying to. I think his weird praise of Kurtz is himself trying to make sense of the madness he's seeing and trying to justify it in a logical way when really there's no way to justify what Kurtz is doing. There's no way to justify the Viet Cong supposedly cutting off the arms of people they had inoculated for polio. There's no justification for the napalm scenes or anything else. I think it just broke Dennis Hopper.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting because as a photojournalist, like not a combatant, he is a little bit removed from the madness. He's still very much so in it.
Yes,
but he's like, I think he's able to approach his madness he's able to have a bit more perspective about it just because
even if that perspective is arguably skewed, it's certainly a perspective.
Yeah. Right. It's not like he's not fully removed enough to like have like full perspective.
Correct.
But more so than like some of the combatants who are really just like so much of their day to day is just trying to like not die,
survive.
That like they can't help but get caught in it and get swept up by it. Whereas he's able to like try to justify it a little bit, which finally brings us to Kurtz,
the man himself.
Okay. Before we get to Kurtz, though, I want to use this to segue into it because we haven't really spoken about it too much yet. But I feel like so much of the appeal of Apocalypse Now is the sort of mystique around the making of it and like all the crazy stories. We talked about Hearts of Darkness before, that they had too much money, too much time, and they all went crazy.
There was a typhoon that wrecked an entire set. Martin Sheen had a heart attack and had to crawl, like 3/4 of a mile through the jungle to find safety. It was a harrowing experience.
After the heart attack, there are like scenes that are just, it's Martin Sheen's brother.
Yeah.
It's not Martin Sheen.
Joe Estevez.
Yeah. Also hilarious name, Joe. But yeah, so part of the mystique also is just like the Marlon Brando of it all. And there's so much to get into there. And I feel like this is one of those movies where you watch the movie itself and that is amazing. And like that on its own is worthy of being a movie that is talked about for
as an essential.
But then you also get to everything from behind the scenes and like the making of, and it just makes the legend like that much bigger for what the movie is and like how it exists in our collective
And the fact that it
consciousness or
even
whatever.
happened.
Yeah, like this movie is so insane. You watch the documentary and you're like, oh, this movie about the descent into madness also caused like this director to descend into madness, and he made a lot of great movies after this, but like this was definitely like a turning point
Certainly.
in Coppola's career.
But also, really, you look at this and Michael Cimino, who made Deer Hunter, came back with Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate and Apocalypse Now Apocalypse Now was critically acclaimed and everything else, but these are the Heaven's Gate and Apocalypse Now were some of the last movies of the new Hollywood where they had the auteurs just here, we'll just give you money and you can do whatever you want. And there was a real reversal back to studio control in the 80s.
Yeah. Well, what a wild concept, right? You give this guy unlimited funds, you tell him to fly over to the Philippines and shoot a movie, and it doesn't matter how long it takes to shoot it, how much money you need, just make your
vision.
Your vision. And then, like you said, we get to the 80s and things sort of like revert back. And like there's so much to celebrate within the 80s and like this version of filmmaking, but that's when like there's like the Spielberg aspect of all of it and like the studio control and everything is we're not getting these like big sweeping auteurish pictures the same way that we were in the late 70s.
Well, and the people that do make them are, someone like Terrence Malick is certainly outside of the traditional Hollywood.
Yeah, well, he stopped making movies in the 80s because he's like
exactly, and Kubrick moved to London, so he was away from that Hollywood control.
Yeah, and those big sweeping auteurish movies are like not ones that we talk about when we talk about the 80s, right? Like Last Temptation of Christ, like Martin Scorsese shooting this, making this like very personal, epic movie about Jesus doesn't resonate with us the same way that like The Goonies does.
No, and it's it also came between Raging Bull and Goodfellas is kind of a weird. Well, and I guess what was the After Hours? Underrated,
amazing movie. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, just like sort of like understanding where this movie like fits into the context of like Hollywood history and also just like American history, right? Like 80s, we have Reagan. Like we're trying to like get back to some sense of normalcy in whatever ways we can,
or a desired sense of normalcy, but for a nostalgia that perhaps never existed.
Yeah. But it's like really, it's reflected in the movies of the era. And like 100%. This is very much so a movie of its era where it was still like rock and roll, bucking up against the establishment or whatever, questioning the authority, just like double middle fingers up, like, F you, I'm Francis Ford Coppola, I'm going to do what I want. And his career was like never really the same after. We'll see what happens this year with
the new
Megalopolis or Megalopolis. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Megalopolis, I believe. Yeah.
Where was I going before I went on that?
Brando.
Oh, Brando. So, okay. All this to say is that the legend outside of the movie very much so enhances this movie's standing within history.
Exactly.
And part of it is the Brando of it all.
Part of it is the Brando effect. He showed up extremely overweight. He had not learned his lines. As far as we know, he was kind of free jazzing it with his spoken scenes, and he reads a lot of poetry and such. And we talked about this while we were watching. If anything, I feel like the movie would have been worse had Marlon Brando been this stock antagonist evil guy at the end of the movie that the hero has to vanquish and everything else. Him being in the shadows so you couldn't tell he was overweight. And the lighting and the interior. And he doesn't really leave that temple very often.
No.
He's stuck in there. And I think that adds to the mystique of the character and the mystique of having one of the most famous actors in movie history. He was an old Hollywood legend, and he has top billing, and he's barely in the movie.
He's barely in the movie and was apparently a nightmare
Yes.
on set. I think it was trying to tie it back to the Dennis Hopper of it all, because
They did not get along.
they were butting heads so much to the point that like any scenes of the two of them together were just cut out of the movie because they could not work together. Everyone was furious with Brando when he showed up, because also like they had already been working on this movie for forever.
Yeah.
Martin Sheen had already almost died.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, like Brando shows up and he's like, I'm Marlon Brando. I can do whatever the hell I want. I have the resume. I can do anything.
And it's still a phenomenal performance.
Yeah, because he's
Marlon
Marlon
Brando, correct.
But yeah, he shows up having not read the script and was just like an absolute disaster to everyone. But like you said, I don't know if it's so much like knowing that or if it's just what it produced on screen that made it great.
It's
there's like
a little column A, a little column B.
Some combination of the two where like it really does elevate the movie. Like him blabbering on about his river in Ohio where he grew up.
Yeah.
Makes absolutely no sense. But it does make sense for the character to be someone
to show the madness and his thoughts ping-ponging all over the place. You know, the photojournalist says, you know, you should have heard him yesterday. He said that he said this beautiful poem and he was looking inwards, and then I tried to take his picture and he threatened to kill me.
Yeah. And I wonder how much of that was like in the script, or if like if we were supposed to see him reading the poem and like say all of those things that were so beautiful. But it's kind of better when it's someone else saying that about him as opposed to us seeing it for ourselves. Like we only see the madness.
Because it adds to this general aura of like mystique. Like he's supposed to be a godlike figure. In the novella Heart of Darkness, Kurtz becomes a godlike figure to the Congolese workers on the rubber plantation, and then in the hill country of Cambodia, the hill people natives, the Montagnards, and then his own soldiers and everyone else, they've all gone to him as their sense of control and their sense of trying to make sense of the madness. And to them, that seems the only logical step for them.
Do you think there is something to that with this guy, like with this character? What do you make of the whole, like, is it paratrooping that Willard is like obsessed with? Like, why did he do the?
So you know that Kurtz himself is supposed to be he's like a grandson and a son of West Point graduates. He's himself a West Point graduate. He had everything set in his life, and after he goes to his first tour of Vietnam, he comes back changed, and he joins the Special Forces at the age of 38. He goes through airborne jump school and everything, becomes a Green Beret. You know, Willard himself says, I went through paratrooper school at 19 and it almost killed me. Like, the drive of this person and really the arrogance that Kurtz was like, only I know how to win this war. And if the military high command won't see that, I will show them. And that's where you get, oh, he's not doing war our way, so we got to get rid of him. You know, he's certainly a tragic figure. I don't think he's supposed to be truly sympathetic because he's not a good person.
Yeah.
But he's killing his own people at his temple, and everyone's just going along with it.
Yeah. But you know what? I'm not going to make the joke.
Yeah. So the generals view Kurtz and his methods as savage, but you watch the helicopter scene, you watch the scene where they investigate the boat. I mean, that's all savagery.
It's not done with.
It's not done with
arrows.
It's not done with an intent that, quote unquote, makes sense to the generals back in DC or Saigon.
It's done with a uniform and it's done with a machine gun, so it's like it's civilized.
Yes.
But if you do it with, cloth around your waistband and a spear, that's savage.
Yeah.
And like, so again, it is interesting to like have that Kurtz character sort of sit in the halfway point between those two different kinds of cultures and
two different kinds of way of war.
But really like both sides of it are as dark as the other. it's not like, which like again, like why is like in the shadows the whole time, like he's a shadowy figure. It's not like there's like one good side to him and one bad side to him. There are these two sides to him, and both are pretty dark.
Yes.
And there's right, like it's that duality, it's that connection between all of us, it's that ambiguity of like right and wrong, and who's to say like which methods are actually better, right? This movie doesn't really call into question like or like propose like here's some sort of way that we can all be more decent to each other. It really is kind
It's
of
really
just
just
like,
an expose of what happens when someone goes through a trauma that specifically is about war.
yeah,
Where the trauma in the novella is the the degradation and the destruction of the Congolese people for the rubber, and here it's the subjugation and the desecration and the destruction of the Vietnamese people.
yeah, this movie does have a big aspect of there's a lot of war as hell in this movie, which I think we've spoken about sort of
Yeah, and there's no people die for no good reason very quickly.
mm-hmm.
There's no final words that are
No.
like, oh, this and that, or some go get him, or something glorious. No,
Yeah.
it's miserable, it's
Tell my
dark.
mom, yeah. The clean character, Larry Fishburne, his character, it's just it's a quick flash, and
The only thing,
one minute he's there, the next minute he's not.
you just hear the recording of his mother and the poor chief just crying over him, and that's war.
Yeah,
It's not all guns and glory.
no, it fucking sucks. And but war is also that bridge area, right? That last outpost where it's horrifying. It is, and like again, to bring it back to my dad, like I'm we as a family are lucky enough that he was not on the front lines, and he still has trauma from what he experienced out there. But as someone who is mostly on the base and not on the front lines, like he's able to talk about like what his friends saw, and just like seeing the trauma in their eyes, and knowing that they were out there in that hell that like the rest of us just like can't even begin to imagine.
No,
And this movie does a good job of depicting it, but like we'll still never truly know.
no, and I will never say I can never know what that experience is like. And
Yeah.
Truly, I don't think you can unless you're there, yeah.
Yeah, it's like an extremely difficult thing to communicate, but I do appreciate the fact that this movie does try to communicate it. And like there are moments in this movie where you should feel like you yourself are going crazy, where you feel like you yourself are horrified at what it is that you're seeing. And to go back to your point from earlier in the episode, like it's pretty hard to walk away from this movie and not think like, yeah, that's pretty anti-war. Everything that happened, like there's nothing like nice that happened there.
No, not at all.
And even the ending, like the ending isn't like, okay, like yay, our hero, our protagonist, like did the thing, he killed the bad guy. It's just like,
But the war's still going on. Someone else is gonna.
like he did it,
Yeah.
and it just ends, and you kind of like feel empty. Like there's no like real sort of
There's no denouement. There's no resolution. There's no catharsis. It just is.
yeah, he kills him, and then that's it.
Yeah.
And like yeah, the lack of resolution is like insane. You're like, wait, I just spent 3 hours with this, and I just sort of feel like this emptiness in me. But I feel like that's the point of the movie.
Yeah, Willard is himself empty. He comments that the entire time he's in Vietnam, he just wants to get home, and once he's home, the entire time he's there, he just wants to get back to Vietnam. There's that's emptiness.
Yeah,
He doesn't know what's normal anymore.
yeah. But it's not to say that it's emptiness in like in a bad way, because right, like obviously we're talking about this movie as being essential, and like just got to put it out there that this is like one of the greatest achievements of cinema
100%.
that anyone has ever put together. So like it's not that I felt an emptiness of like, wow, like what was the point of those 3 hours? I think that's the point of the movie, and that's kind of like the beauty of its construction, is that it's meant to take you on this journey where you then feel so gutted that it kind of like makes you call into question all of these things that you maybe thought that you knew previously about how the world worked around
You know, and not every journey is heroic. Sometimes the journey is just the journey, and there's no resolution, and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be in the Vietnam War. You could have, you're working on a project for, for months, and then you decide to scrap the project and go a different direction.
Yeah.
It's that happens in life. Sometimes the journey and then the mission you're given or you're ordered to go on there is that sense of not, like a neutrality emptiness, but like an emptiness of like, oh, geez.
Yeah. That's kind of the big takeaway from me. It's like, oh,
yeah.
oh, shucks.
Yeah. Me reaping. This is awesome. This is awesome. Me sowing. Oh, dude, this sucks.
Oh man. Dude, this movie is like absolutely insane. I mean, to just like go back to the cinematic aspect of it, again, flying out to Manila, having an entire crew out there to film this.
Coppola brought his family. They rented a house for years
to put together these epic moments of cinema that again are like not very glorious, but like still wholly impressive, of
very and raw,
leveling bridges and all of these explosions, destroying tree lines,
dozens of helicopters,
yeah, like
we commented on the Kilgore scene, like not even talking about the production people, but there's easily 200 extras and people
on screen.
The scale of it all is just staggering.
Yeah. And then to think about that, and like the way that the camera moves when Kilgore gets out of the helicopter, I think it's when he gets out of the helicopter,
and it is falling.
Yeah, starts like it's this tracking shot that starts up high and then it goes a little bit lower, and like, but still you are having the cues of all of the explosions in the background, and it's just like, dude, that is filmmaking.
Yes,
like, not to sound like a total nerd, but like that's it.
So I looked it up. So Robert Duvall was nominated for Best Supporting Actor. He did not win. Coppola was nominated for Best Director. He did not win at the Oscars, but it won for sound design and cinematography. And I mean,
deserves it.
Totally deserves it. We were talking compared to a Vietnam movie, and now, especially, our generation, we grew up with like Forrest Gump and stuff. So we're coded to hear, like, oh, we hear CCR. That's clearly a Vietnam movie and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's really only 3 pieces of like pop music in the movie, and it's the Rolling Stones, CCR, or not originally a CCR song, but very clearly meant to be a stand-in for CCR at the USO scene, and obviously the Doors song, which plays at the beginning and the end.
Yeah,
and it's called The End.
Only non-diegetic of the songs that's played, the Doors song, at the beginning and end, because the Satisfaction Rolling Stone song that's played on a radio that they're listening to, and then I believe Susie Q.
There's a band on stage,
who's playing it. So,
and because everything else is really moody, like soundscapes, it's almost ambient, like you just hear the dong dong of like just a bass heavy like keyboard, and it just ratchets up the tension, like it forces you to pay attention. We were talking how the score doesn't drive it. It's not like when you first hear the Imperial March in Star Wars and the Star Destroyers are going over and you're like, oh, really. And if anything, it forces you to pay attention to the background and everything else.
It's like, not to throw shade at John Williams, because he is the GOAT, but like John Williams scores are like very much so designed to like inform you how to feel during a particular scene. Like, it's the emotional driving force, whereas the score here is like very much so just complementary to the images, and all of the images that you see are very much so informing your emotional state or reaction to the movie in a given moment. And then you're like, oh, also like that score is like pretty good right now, but it's not like, okay, like things are swelling, so like start to feel, this way, start to feel that way. It's just it's what you're watching that makes you feel a certain way, and then the score is just enhancing that.
Totally.
It's like absolutely incredible. Like every single aspect of this movie is just like absolutely clicking. Like you said, the sound design, like the explosions and the helicopters, and then how like quiet it is during the French scenes. You know, like that's
Yeah.
very,
You just hear the
very,
jungle.
yeah, that's very intentional.
Yes.
But it's all absolutely,
But when you compare it to, something like Platoon, where you hear that motif and that refrain in the orchestra
yeah,
in the soundtrack, and you hear it multiple times throughout the movie because it's very much like on Charlie Sheen and everything else, and there's none of that here. It's all in
no,
service of the mood, maybe.
yeah, and it's not, yeah, it's interesting because it's not like one soundtrack that like will keep coming back to the same
No,
things. Everything is very singular. It's just like this is for
this
this
scene, this
moment.
serves
This
this
is for the,
purpose.
yeah. It's great, yeah, and I feel like the score is definitely not something that I've like typically noticed when watching this movie, just because there's so much else to be.
There's so much else going on. Yeah.
The one big bit of trivia that we didn't talk about yet is the Harrison Ford appearance
Oh yeah, we
early in the
haven't
movie.
talked about that.
But one of his like, I mean, this is post Star Wars, but
Mm,
it was filmed
it was filmed pre Star Wars.
pre Star
So
Wars.
this is right after his appearance in American Graffiti.
Yeah, and obviously Lucas and Coppola were boys, and Lucas was like, "Yo, I've got this guy Harrison Ford. Like, he's great. He's gonna be a
He built
star.
my deck.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you should put him. You should put him in Apocalypse Now."
Mhm.
And Coppola was like, "Whatever, sure."
Mhm.
So it would have been more interesting if this had come out before Star Wars, but because there was already like, the Star Wars hype.
Yeah.
Harrison Ford was already kind of Harrison Ford,
Right.
but not quite because it's pre Empire Strikes.
And it's also, I pointed it out. I don't believe he has an official character name, but Gunnery Sergeant Hartman from Full Metal Jacket, from the very,
Oh,
very
yeah.
famous scenes in the beginning of the movie where he's berating his recruits.
Yeah.
He's a helicopter pilot
Yeah.
in Apocalypse Now, and I believe he was a military advisor to the film, and they just ended up throwing him in as a cameo because he was in the Philippines.
Yeah. They were like, this guy's got great eyebrows.
Yeah.
He should be on
And he's had a couple tours in Nam, like he was familiar with Kiwis and everything else, I believe. So
Yeah. Insane. And the whole movie was filmed in the Philippines.
Coppola wanted access to American military equipment, which the Philippines had a lot of. I mean, it wasn't until the end of the dictatorship under Marcos in the Philippines that, the U.S. still had bases there for a very, very long time, obviously former American colony and everything else. But he had access to all of that could have possibly been surplus from Vietnam.
Yeah. I can't remember what it was exactly, but I want to say that there was something with the helicopters where like they had like destroyed so many helicopters, and like I think like the army bases in the Philippines did not want to
Give him helicopters.
give him any more, and Coppola like was like struggling with that. This movie like broke him.
Yeah.
As a person, as a filmmaker, but it's like The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 are obviously incredible, but like, is this his crowning achievement? Maybe.
I mean, that's my personal opinion. I mean, the Godfather in part 1 and 2 are, they're epics, and this is epic in a different way. It's not epic in terms of like a heroic journey or anything. It's epic in its scope and its intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's not epic
and like the sense of like a capital E epic. Yeah. Like the hero.
It's a bleak epic.
Yeah.
There's no heroicism and there's no heroics in this. I don't think I have any other bits of trivia. It's been a while since I've seen Hearts of Darkness, but so I otherwise would have had a bit more. Did you have anything else?
No, not really. I mean, the main, it's just some fun cameos, like the Coppola cameo, the Bill Graham cameo. I believe at some point Charlie Sheen was a background character in this. I think they brought Charlie and maybe Emilio over once Martin Sheen had the heart attack to try to like ground him and like have family and like, because it was a very intense process for everyone out there.
Absolutely insane. It's not going to be one of my recommendations, but for anyone who has not seen Hearts of Darkness, it is like, there aren't a lot out there, but it is the definitive documentary about the making of a movie.
Yes.
But also, I think I saw this recently. Coppola's wife pass? Who
she shot a lot of the background
I think she
footage and stuff that they gave to the creators of Mad TV were the ones who did Hearts of Darkness. I saw.
Really?
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think she did most of the shooting. She like captured a lot of that footage. I'm pretty sure I saw that she died.
I mean, Coppola himself is in his 80s. He's not a young guy.
So if she did, big RIP and condolences to her and the Coppola family, because that's a big loss.
It's interesting. I just thought of this, but we called out how Tropic Thunder, the great send up of Hollywood in general, but certainly Vietnam War movies and everything else, ends up being a documentary instead of the actual movie they tried to make.
Oh yeah.
So it like obviously the parallels to the calls out to Apocalypse Now and Platoon in the movie are very deliberate, but it ends up also being a commentary, maybe slightly a commentary on Hearts of Darkness and the making of the movie itself being part of the mystique.
Yeah. I can't think of another movie that has as much mystique around the making of it as this.
No.
It's like as big of the appeal of this movie. I don't want to say as big as the movie itself, but it's up there.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe Waterworld just because it wasted so much money, but we're not talking about Waterworld in the same canon as Apocalypse Now. But in terms of movies that are universally regarded as fantastic and must sees, yeah, the mystique and the filming of it was anything but normal.
Yeah, really a lost time, like a bygone era in filmmaking.
Yes.
Could you imagine if like Oppenheimer gave Christopher Nolan this much trouble?
He has a break. Yeah, Cillian Murphy has a breakdown in the New Mexico desert, and
like
also, I mean, I don't know if those sorts of production troubles and everything else would not necessarily fly this day and age, but beyond what Coppola was telling, Lionsgate and American Zoetrope, it's not like people were like posting on Instagram that they were stuck in a typhoon in the Philippines while they were making this, or like people talking on social media about the production and everything. Cause nowadays, if that happened and, the word is getting out that it's so troubled that they'd cut their losses immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. A lot of this would not fly today. Also just, I mean, the kind of like, not to say that I don't think there are really stories of Coppola being like abusive to anyone, but just like the whole like energy around the making of this movie is inherently not ideal conditions for people to be living
chaotic.
Yeah, a bit of a negative workplace environment to be in.
Very much so.
Put it in a very, very, very positive framing. Yeah, man, it like absolutely just insane bonkers stuff. But it gave us one of the best movies of all time. So like that's cool. I guess we'll take it.
I mean, just there's so many acknowledgments to the movie. The scene in Small Soldiers when the whatever the toy soldiers are, one of them flies a helicopter and it's Flight of the Valkyries. Like we wouldn't have that association without Apocalypse Now. We already mentioned Tropic Thunder with the napalm scene.
Yeah.
And
it is interesting that this movie doesn't like inform more movies that have come
it's
after
all call outs.
But like
it's references. It's not listed as an inspiration, but everyone who wants to like have a wink wink nudge nudge to film nerds will have
I love the smell of whatever
in the morning. Yeah. And you hear that like Small Soldiers is a kids movie. Like you have characters in all sorts of movies that end up having callbacks to certain films.
It's kind of interesting because like no one has tried to like recreate Apocalypse Now. Like Tropic Thunder is the closest thing that we've
and it's very much a comedy. Like this is a war drama.
Yeah, like no one else was able to try to recreate this. It is interesting with like subsequent Vietnam War movies that I think Apocalypse Now sort of benefits from being one of the first to really be commenting on the war in like any sort of critical way.
Yes.
Because then Platoon comes out in what, like 84?
85, 86, yeah, and Full Metal Jacket was a little after
It
that.
was like 88, and like Full Metal Jacket kind of suffers from, okay, we've already seen so much commentary about Vietnam. Like, do we really need another one? Which is like part of the reason why that movie like struggled in ways that, not struggled, but like failed to capture the zeitgeist the way that something like Platoon or Apocalypse Now before it kind of did.
Mm-hmm.
Not really super
I mean, I'm
relevant
trying
to
to, what I mean, the Five Bloods again is also, it's a movie about war, but it's not a war film. Maybe, I mean, I guess, the Mel Gibson vehicle, We Were Soldiers, which I think is much more, I mean, it's brutal, but I think it's much more of a pro-war movie than an anti-war movie. But I mean, we really don't I mean, have we said enough in the pantheon of Vietnam movies that they don't make them in the
yeah.
ways they keep making World War II movies? Like, is it still such a raw nerve?
I don't know if it's that we have said enough. I think we've like said all that we're willing to listen to.
That's a fair point.
Like, it's still not easy,
Well,
but it's
Americans
easy.
want to watch a movie where they win.
Yeah, it's easier to tell the story, to tell World War II stories, because it's good versus evil. We know the outcome. It doesn't. They don't. It's World War II movies like aren't going to ask that much of the audience in terms of like engaging with it.
And asking like hard moral questions.
Yeah. Whereas Apocalypse Now, you sit down and watch this, and like you can just sit down and watch it and like enjoy it for its cinematic quality. But like if you're like really,
If you're watching it not thinking, it's kind of missing the point.
yeah, like this movie does want you to engage and like ask yourself some hard questions, and
With no
you
easy
know,
answers.
yeah, exactly, without presenting you easy answers. And it's not like we don't have the answers. It's
It's a presentation.
it's just, yeah, like you need to ask, like the answer is you need to ask yourself these questions. Okay, well, Tex, I think we covered pretty much everything. We hit a lot of different areas.
We could certainly keep going, but for the benefit of our listeners,
Yeah, we'll try to wrap things up. Yeah, this has been an absolutely amazing discussion. I always love being able to do this in person because I feel like the conversations just become so much more lively, and we're really able to like dig into.
you're riffing off someone else's idea, and you
Yeah,
touching on points that I hadn't thought of, and vice versa. And especially having watched it literally this morning,
yeah,
and having that, I had my notes ahead of time, but then just adding more. And if you're watching to pay attention, you really just do notice more. And
yeah.
we were able to talk about a lot of the things that we brought up when we watched it together.
And like, yeah, having those ideas fresh. Yeah, man, I feel like the depth of the conversations is always so much more when we do it in person.
IRL.
Not
Yeah.
to talk shit about any of the virtual episodes that we've done, because they're also really, really, really,
Go give
really
them a
great
listen.
conversations
Yes.
that happen there with a lot of also really awesome, interesting, cool, thoughtful people. But yeah, Tex, I think we've covered most of the bases that we wanted to cover. We really hit it all, from the themes to the technical aspects of the movie to the mystique of it itself, characters, all that good stuff. So I think we're good to do recommendations.
I think we are.
Everyone's favorite portion of each episode, just in case we have any new listeners out there who might be joining us for the first time. I'll quickly run through the rules for recommendations. So for each movie that we introduce into the canon, we also recommend 3 things per co-host guest of other things to check out if you like said movie. Those 3 things, at least one of them has to be another movie, and the other 2 things can be any and everything else. It could be a book, a TV show, a single episode of a TV show, an album, an artist, a video game, a painting, a collection of short stories, another podcast,
A
maybe.
cocktail, you told me.
A cocktail.
Yeah.
We had a cocktail last week for Planet of the Apes. Really anything. A restaurant. Like, we like to get super creative, really weird. For any movies that we do recommend, we just ask that they're not other movies that are already in the canon. So like for Coppola, also made The Godfather. Spoiler alert, The Godfather is in the canon, so we're not going to recommend that. And then we stick to 3. Sometimes we have some folks on. I like to do a 2 for 1, get a little cheeky, but we try to stick to a strict 3 recommendation limit to keep ourselves honest. I know it's hard, but
because everything is just so exciting. There's so much we could recommend.
There's so much. There's too many things to recommend, and then we'd be here all day. So Tex, what we're going to do is you'll give your first recommendation, give a quick reasoning for why you're recommending it for Apocalypse Now, and then I'll give my first, back to you for your second, so on and so forth. So whenever you're ready.
So my first, this is a book we were assigned in the history of the Vietnam War through film. It is a collection of interviews by a journalist named Wallace Terry, and it's called Bloods. It is all about the Black American experience, be where they drafted, or they joined up on their own accord, and it's interviews with all these people and how they, at the tail end of the civil rights era, are all of a sudden asked to fight and die for a country that never particularly cared about them at all. And I think it's really, really, you hear it in their own words. And the experiences they went through are very different and they're very drastic. I mean, there's one that speaks out to me. A Marine came back, landed at JFK Airport, and he was Black. So even though he was in a uniform, no cabbie wanted to pick him up. And he's like, oh, cool, here I am with my medals and everything else, and I can't get a cab at JFK.
It still doesn't matter, yeah.
Yeah, I'd go to, my copy is almost in tatters because I've read it a couple of times, but any used bookstore should have this in their Vietnam section.
Amazing book. I remember I don't know if I read it in high school, but my dad.
You had your dad's copy, right? Yeah.
Obviously, as a Black Vietnam War vet, owned a copy of Bloods, had read it, and definitely connected with it.
Yeah.
It's a wild read. I tried rereading it like 2 years ago, and
there are parts that are very tough.
There are parts that are super tough. There's one guy in particular who talks about, I don't know if it was him or someone who was
in his platoon or something.
In his platoon or something, who would collect the ears of dead Vietnamese people that he had killed, and he wore them as a necklace around his
flak jacket.
Yeah. And I mean, I was reading on the F train one day, and I was like, I can't do this right now. This is like way too intense for me. But I would like to give it a reread at some point. That's an amazing first recommendation. I'm happy that you.
Well, I'm excited to hear yours.
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think I'm just going to bounce off that one, and I'm going to recommend The Five Bloods, the Spike Lee movie.
Yes.
From about now almost 4 years ago. Vietnam. Well, Vietnam is like a backdrop for the movie. It's about 4 Vietnam vets who, like 40 years later, go back to Vietnam to search for a treasure, like some hidden gold that they found when they served there all these years back, with a 5th member of their crew. So it's like half war, half treasure hunt kind of movie, but a really cool, interesting look, kind of exploring like similar things to, the Bloods.
And the Black veteran experience being very different.
Being a very different kind of experience. And fun fact, in that movie, the hotel that they stay at in the first scene, I think it's some hotel in Saigon. It's where I stayed when I went to
cool.
my family. They were like walking through the lobby, and I was like, I know that lobby. I've been in that lobby.
Yeah, Spike Lee called Papa Stood Up and was like, I'm going to Saigon. Where do I stay?
And he wrecks. Yeah. That should be one of my recommendations at hotel. But it's not. The Five Bloods.
Yes.
It's my first one. Yeah.
Great recommendation. My second, and I mentioned this while we were filming, the Ken Burns documentary on Vietnam is excellent. The interviews with the American and the Vietnamese veterans and the French veterans and everyone, journalists. It even talks to people that fled to Canada because they didn't want to be drafted, and had to come into terms with how they felt, as men or as Americans. And I'm a big fan of 9 Inch Nails, and Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross did all the music. And so, it starts chronologically, so it goes through the war till the very end. So in the early 60s, you hear songs that, you don't hear CCR yet, you don't hear anything
Yeah.
else yet. And there's one scene where they show just the chaos of the Tet Offensive, and it's all these scenes from across Vietnam during the Tet Offensive, the siege of the embassy in Saigon, Khe Sanh, the Battle of Hue, and it's all set to the opening drum beat of "Tomorrow Never Knows" by the Beatles, and it just loops. And it's just
Yeah.
if you know the song, it's really heavy drum beat, and it's totally
Yeah.
unlike anything else on the album, and it's scary, and that's what the Tet Offensive
Yeah.
was. So I cannot recommend it enough for what the war was like to the people that fought it.
Yeah. And just like everyone who experienced it in so many different ways. That's a great pick. I feel like I started it and just didn't finish it because it's like 1,000 hours long. But
Yeah,
it
I'm
is,
trying to remember when I watched it. I think it was a couple years ago. I think I may have been like sick, and I just plowed through like with a box of tissues and some Dayquil.
yeah, that's the way to watch it because it's long. But definitely, I do want to check that out at some point. Okay, cool. I'm gonna try to tie my second recommendation into your second recommendation again. You spoke about the Tet Offensive and how like crazy it was. I'm gonna do another movie based on a book, also about Vietnam. But there is a pivotal moment that happens during the Tet Offensive. The movie, I don't know if a lot of people saw it. I don't think it got like a whole lot of critical buzz, but one of my dear childhood friends was in it,
Oh,
and he has some scenes with Zac Efron,
oh,
with Bill
cool.
Murray, the greatest beer run ever.
Yeah.
It's not like as deep or as heavy of a Vietnam movie
Mhm.
as something like Apocalypse Now is, but if you're looking for something that's kind of like looking back on that period of time from like a more modern perspective with some like modern sensibilities, it's a good movie to check out. My friend, shout out Christopher Reed Brown, plays a character called named Noodle, and I think his character, I'm not just saying this because he's my friend, but like his character does sort of represent a lot of the moral ambiguity that is there
Oh,
within
okay,
the
interesting.
movie, like
Yeah.
for that period of time. So it was like really cool to see. Also, really cool to see him like
Yeah.
next to Zac Efron.
Yeah. That's awesome. Good for him.
Yeah. So that's my second pick, greatest beer run ever.
I'm a music fan. If you know me from beyond the podcast recording, and certainly my friend Raf knows. But I'm going to put together my recommendation will be to the music that we all associate with the Vietnam War and everything else. And it was a turbulent time in American history, not even with the Vietnam War, but also just in terms of what people could do in the studio. Hearing the Beatles in 1966 and then listening to a Led Zeppelin album from 1969, like the production values just jumped, and there was all of this crazy stuff going on, and it was a lot of turbulent music for a very turbulent time. And there's songs that we all we associate with the Vietnam era, like White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane, Edwin Starr's War, any CCR song. I'm sure
Yeah.
John Fogerty might feel a little ways about that, but
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of good tracks from across the musical spectrum, and I encourage you to take a listen and get into the vibe, and maybe check out the Five Bloods and read Bloods, read the greatest beer run
Yeah.
ever, and see what more is out there.
Amazing. I don't know what I want to do for my last pick. I don't know if I want to do another movie or you know what? I should do this movie. Okay. I'm gonna recommend Platoon because one, it's a shame that it's
I'm
not in
really
canon.
very surprised it was not in the canon. It's
Very, very
Oliver
surprising.
Stone's I think Oliver Stone's best.
I certainly think it's his best movie. The reason I'm recommending Platoon, and again, not to like make this whole episode about me, but I remember watching Platoon with my dad, and he was like, "This is what Vietnam was like." So I think for someone like my dad to say that, and like I haven't heard from other Vietnam vets of like which Vietnam War movie they see and are like, that's what it was. But for me, whenever I watch that movie, like I think about my dad,
Yeah.
and like again to make it all about me, Platoon is like probably for my money like the definitive Vietnam War movie. Also, incredible freaking
A
movie.
very, very good movie.
Young Willem Dafoe absolutely crushing it. Also, you have the Sheen connection, Charlie in that one, um, Martin in Apocalypse Now. Who, I mean, the rest of the cast is incredible. Even though I'm forgetting.
Forrest Whitaker, a young Johnny Depp.
Yeah,
There's
one of the Dillon brothers.
Yeah, Matt Dillon, and then
I'm forgetting
Dr.
the
Cox
name.
from
Dr.
Yes,
isn't it? And then I'm forgetting the name of the guy who plays the like the main antagonist within the platoon.
Tom Berenger.
Also,
the legend. He's one of my favorite actors. The legend Keith David is in Platoon.
Oh, dude. I didn't realize Keith David's in Platoon. I fucking love Keith David.
Crushing it in the 80s. He had The Thing. He had Platoon.
Yeah. Stacked cast. Absolutely amazing movie. Obviously based on Oliver Stone's personal experience within Vietnam. So, like, it's kind of, I think of Platoon and Apocalypse Now in, like, the same regards that I think of The Godfather and Goodfellas. Or I guess I should have reversed that. But, like, Goodfellas and Platoon are very much so, like, lived-in experiences of these things. And then Apocalypse Now and The Godfather more so exist as, like, these expressive...
The broad, the bigger,
These, like, expressive, like, operatic dramas about these things. And then Platoon, Goodfellas, it's just, like, this is, like, the gritty, very grounded version of, like, someone's real experience with this particular thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's my last pick. 3 movies. Tex, let's run through our recommendations one last time, and then we'll say our final goodbyes.
So my recommendations were the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, the book Bloods by Wallace Terry, and a Vietnam music playlist, Vietnam War music playlist, I should add, that I will share with Raph, that we can share with the listeners.
Amazing. I love that. My recommendations are Spike Lee's The Five Bloods. I think it was the Farrelly brothers who directed The Greatest Beer Run Ever. Starring my good friend Christopher Reed Brown. Oliver Stone's Platoon. John Corey. Dude, we did it. Apocalypse now.
The apocalypse is now. We've done it.
I think we should get out of here. Maybe go surfing.
We got to find a beach.
We got to find a beach.
Tube City.
we got to get to Tube City. We've gone up the river. We've both lost our minds.
Come back down the river. Now
it's time for us to go back down the river to Tube City so that we can catch some waves. Like Lance and Kilgore.
Exactly.
But seriously, thank you again for
thank you very much for having me. I remember telling you years ago I could talk about Raiders of the Lost Ark or Apocalypse Now whenever you wanted me to. So very honored to be a guest. Been great following your podcast over the years, and seeing, you're my film guy.
I love that. And you're my Vietnam War guy.
Don't tell Mr. Stitt.
I won't. You're my international relations and late 20th century international history guy. So
thank you.
Earlier than that.
Yeah. Why not? I read a lot of Wikipedia.
Thanks again for joining. This has been so much fun. Listeners, thank you for sticking it out with us. We can't do it without you, so thanks as always for listening. If you want to give us a rating review on whatever podcast platform it is that you're listening to us on, 5 stars, leave a little review, we very much appreciate it. Helps us really get the word out there for the show. We will be back next week with an extremely special double feature episode, or I guess a double episode drop, whatever. There's going to be 2 episodes. They're going to come out on the same day. In anticipation for May the 4th, we're going to be dropping a Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back double bill episode next week. Definitely join us there. We're going to have Dahl and King Alvarez, who hasn't been on in a while, but they'll both be on to talk about that. So we will catch you there. And in the meantime, we'll see you in the wasteland.